She arrived at the community music hall just a few minutes before the auditions were supposed to start. The winter air outside was cold enough to sting her fingers, and she rubbed her hands together as she stepped inside. The hall was old, but it still had a warmth to it, like a place filled with memories. Posters from past concerts covered the walls, showing smiling faces of musicians who once stood on the same stage. She was about to step onto Dot. She held her old keyboard case close to her body. It wasn't heavy, but the case had many scratches and tiny dents, showing how long it had been with her. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't new, but it was the only instrument she had ever truly trusted. As she walked in, she saw a group of people already gathered, most of them tuning instruments or talking loudly as if they owned the place. Some had stylish keyboards, shining black guitars, or digital equipment with glowing lights. Everyone seemed full of confidence. Apart from her Dot, she moved quietly to an empty chair near the wall, making sure she didn't disturb anyone. But people noticed her anyway. Two girls sitting nearby looked at her worn-out keyboard case and smirked. A boy with a fancy jacket nudged his friend and whispered something, both laughing quietly. She heard the laughter, but she kept her calm. She had learned long ago that not everyone would understand her journey, and not everyone needed to. The main noise in the room came from a young man sitting near the center. He had the newest model keyboard, one that looked expensive enough to belong in a professional studio. He was playing loudly, showing off complicated finger movements that made others turn to watch. He clearly liked having an audience. Every few seconds he glanced around, making sure people noticed how skilled he was. Some nodded in appreciation, others murmured words of praise. When he noticed her walking in with her old keyboard, he raised his eyebrows in amusement. The smirk on his face was easy to read. It wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of expression someone gives when they think they already know the ending of your story before it has even started. She ignored it and slowly opened the case. The small sound of the zipper seemed loud to her because she knew almost everyone in the room had already judged her. She lifted the keyboard gently, placing it on the stand she had brought from home. It wasn't perfect. Some keys were slightly faded, and one corner of the body had a little crack, but it played well. And that was what mattered most. While she adjusted the bench height, she could still hear the young man talking loudly to someone beside him. "Looks like people will bring anything to auditions these days," he said, making sure she heard him. His voice was dripping with sarcasm. She breathed in slowly and didn't react. She had been underestimated so many times in life that comments like this no longer broke her. If anything, they made her more focused. The rehearsal room grew louder as more participants arrived. Some practiced parts of their songs, some laughed, some checked their phones, and some complained about the wait. She stayed in her corner, warming up her fingers by playing small scales. They were soft and simple, quiet enough that no one really paid attention, but she knew every touch mattered. She closed her eyes for a second, letting her hands remember the feeling of the keys. While she practiced, she noticed the young man again. He was watching her, but not with interest, more like amusement. His arms were crossed, and he shook his head slightly, as if her warm-up confirmed every assumption he already had. Only the audition coordinator brought some order to the noise. A middle-aged man with glasses entered the hall and clapped his hands a few times to get everyone's attention. People slowly stopped talking, though some still whispered or giggled. The coordinator read names from a list, explaining how the first round would work. He told them that the judges were already seated inside the main hall and were expecting each person to be ready quickly. Her name wasn't on the first few calls, so she sat back down and waited. She tried to keep her breathing steady. Waiting was always the hardest part. She could play for hours without fear, but waiting gave too much space for doubt to creep in. She reminded herself why she was here. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. She was here because the piano had always been the one thing that made her feel free. From across the room, she overheard someone whispering about her keyboard again. "Maybe she borrowed it from a school," one person said. Chuckling, "She's probably just here for fun," another added. The comments stung a little, but she didn't let them affect her. She looked at her hands, the hands that had practiced countless mornings and nights when no one was watching. These hands had played through loneliness, through stress, through self-doubt. People could judge her case, her clothes, her quietness, but they could not judge her heart. More names were called. One by one, participants went inside the main auditorium for their turn, and most came out looking nervous or disappointed. Some frowned, some shook their heads, and some avoided eye contact with others. The atmosphere in the room slowly changed from confidence to tension. She kept sitting quietly, listening to the sounds around her, yet staying in her own world. Every now and then, she closed her eyes and imagined being alone with a piano, like she used to be when she first started learning. She remembered playing in a small room at home, where the only audience was the hum of the ceiling fan. Back then, she didn't care about impressing anyone. She played because she loved the sound of the keys and the peace it brought her. After several minutes, the coordinator finally called her name. She stood up calmly. Some people looked at her with mild curiosity. Others barely noticed. But the confident young man heard her name and shot her another smirk. As if he was already expecting her to walk back out in embarrassment, she picked up her keyboard carefully and walked toward the door leading to the main hall. Her steps were slow but steady. She could feel every heartbeat echoing in her chest, yet her face showed calmness. When she entered, she saw the judges sitting behind a long table. They looked professional but tired, probably after hearing dozens of rushed performances. The stage wasn't huge, but it had enough space for her stand and bench. She placed her keyboard in the center as the judges watched silently. One of them glanced briefly at her old instrument, and she could see doubt flicker in their eyes. She didn't blame them. First impressions often mislead people. She plugged in the power cable, adjusted the volume, and sat down. The hall was much quieter than the rehearsal room. Only a few murmurs could be heard from people sitting in the back rows, maybe other participants or staff members. The lights above the stage felt warm on her face. She took a slow breath and let her fingers rest gently on the keys. She could sense the quiet judgments of the room, the assumptions, the doubts, the whispers. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the sound she was about to create. The first test note she pressed was soft, almost like a whisper. It wasn't the real beginning of her performance, just a simple check. But even that single note had a kind of clarity, a softness that felt like it carried emotion rather than noise. She saw one of the judges raise their eyebrows slightly, as if the sound surprised them just a little. The room wasn't silent yet. People in the back were still talking quietly. Someone rustled papers. Another person tapped their foot. She closed her eyes for a moment and prepared herself. She wasn't here to compete with shiny instruments or loud confidence. She wasn't here for attention. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong, but she knew that when she played, her music would speak for her. She could still feel the smirk of the young man from the rehearsal room lingering in her mind. But instead of bothering her, it gave her a small spark of strength. She knew exactly what she was capable of, even if no one else did. With her fingers resting lightly on the keys and her heart steadying itself, she was ready to begin. She didn't know how the judges would react. She didn't know if she would move to the next round. But she knew one thing for sure. The moment she touched that first real note, the room would finally hear her truth, and that truth was something no one could smirk at. When her hands touched the keys again, the hall was still not fully quiet. A few people in the back were whispering. Someone opened a water bottle, and another person shuffled in their chair. But she didn't let any of that distract her. She focused on the soft glow of the stage lights, the cool feel of the keys, and the quiet air around her. The judge in the center nodded gently, giving her permission to begin. She dipped her head in a small acknowledgement, but she didn't speak. She wasn't here to talk. She was here to play. As she sat there, she could feel every heartbeat in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The kind of feeling that comes right before something important. She took a slow breath, a breath that seemed to settle her entire body, and then she pressed the first real note. It was soft at first, like a warm breeze moving through a silent room. The sound spread gently through the hall, reaching every corner. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It carried something inside it, emotion, intention, a kind of honesty that no one expected, One of the judges, who had been adjusting their pen just a moment before, froze. Another leaned back slightly, surprised. In the back rows, the whispers faded as people slowly turned their heads toward the stage. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She could feel the change. She could sense when a room was listening, even without seeing their faces. And the room was finally listening. Her fingers moved slowly at first, touching each key with care. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress anyone with speed or showy tricks. Instead, she let the notes breathe. Each one flowed into the next like a story. She had lived herself. She remembered all the times she had practiced late at night when everyone else was asleep. She remembered playing during storms, when the sound of rain outside became part of her music. She remembered the quiet mornings when the sun was barely rising and the world was still calm. These memories came back to her now, guiding her hands like old friends. In the back of the hall, a boy who had been scrolling through his phone looked up. He paused, confused, as if his ears caught something too beautiful to ignore. He lowered his phone slowly, forgetting whatever he was looking at. She shifted into the next part of the piece, adding a little more strength, a little more emotion. The notes began to dance lightly, rising and falling like waves. The sound wasn't perfect, no performance ever was, and sometimes real music is what touches people the most. The judge on the right leaned forward, elbows on the table. The judge on the left smiled faintly, the kind of smile someone makes when they're pleasantly surprised. She didn't see any of it. Her eyes stayed mostly on the keys, but sometimes she closed them for a second, letting her hands lead the way. Her old keyboard, the one that many had mocked, responded beautifully. It knew her touch. It knew her style. It had traveled with her through every moment of growth. And now it was helping her speak to the room in a language only music could express. She shifted into a softer passage, letting the melody trail gently like a quiet confession. The hall was completely silent now. No whispers. No chair sounds. No papers moving. Even the people in the back sat still. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a small spark of confidence. Not pride. Not arrogance. Just a warm, steady belief in herself. She knew she wasn't the most experienced person here. She didn't have expensive equipment or years of coaching. But she did have something that couldn't be bought. Heart. And that heart was woven into every note she was playing. Suddenly, she caught a small movement in the corner of her eye. The side door of the hall opened quietly. Someone from the rehearsal room, maybe staff, maybe another participant, stepped inside. It hardly mattered who it was. The moment they heard her music, they stopped. Their hand froze on the door handle, as if the sound pinned them in place. She kept going. Her fingers glided smoothly, moving from soft to strong, from gentle to firm, telling a silent story of everything she had carried inside herself. Every struggle, every lonely moment, every small victory, all of it was there in her music. In that moment, she didn't feel out of place anymore. She didn't feel like the girl with the old keyboard. She didn't feel like someone trying to prove her worth. She felt like a musician. Someone who had something to offer. Someone who belonged. She moved into a brighter part of the piece, letting the notes shimmer lightly. It felt like bringing sunlight into the room, warm, comforting, full of hope. A few people in the back sat up straighter, as if the music reached inside them and lifted something. A woman with a notepad blinked slowly. Absorbing each sound, one of the judges glanced at the others as if silently saying, "Are you hearing this too?" They weren't expecting this level of emotion from someone who walked in quietly with an old keyboard. But here it was, unexpected, refreshing, almost magical. She didn't notice their exchange. She was too lost in the moment, too connected to the music. Each note felt like a step on a path she had walked many times before. She didn't have to think. She simply played from instinct. When she reached the middle of the piece, she added more strength. Her fingers pressed deeper into the keys, yet her touch remained controlled. The sound grew fuller, richer, filling the hall like a rising tide. It wasn't overwhelming, it was powerful in a graceful way. In the back, someone whispered, "Who is she?" But even that whisper seemed respectful, not mocking. She could feel her heartbeat mixing with the rhythm of the music. Every part of her was focused, steady, alive. Even though she was sitting alone on the stage, she didn't feel alone at all. It felt like the music itself was standing with her, guiding her, supporting her. The judges exchanged another look. One of them wrote something down quickly, their expression shifting from tired boredom to real interest. She let the intensity rise a little more, letting the melody climb upward. The hall had grown warmer, or maybe it just felt that way. The sound echoed off the walls, gentle but strong, wrapping itself around everyone in the room. Then, slowly, she brought the energy down again. Her fingers softened, easing into a calmer section. The notes became lighter, almost like footprints on sand. The audience stayed completely still. Even the air seemed to freeze. Listening, she knew she couldn't hold them like this forever. But for now, while she had their attention, she wanted to give them everything she had. She ended the section with a soft, lingering note that hung in the air like a breath that refused to fade. She let her hands rest for a moment before moving into the final part. But before she continued, she heard a small sound. Someone exhaled sharply, as if they had been holding their breath without realizing it. She realized then that the room wasn't just listening. The room was feeling. And that was the moment she knew she had reached them. Her fingers lifted for just a second as she prepared for the next part, the part that would show her full strength. But this wasn't the strong finish yet. This was simply the moment where she understood something important. The music had finally broken through the doubt. The noise, the whispers, the smirks, they were no longer seeing the quiet girl with the old keyboard. They were seeing the musician she had always been, and the real moment, the one that would change. Everything was still waiting in the next breath. The hall was so silent that she could almost hear the faint buzz of the ceiling lights. That silence wasn't empty, it felt full, like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for what she would do next. She let her hands hover over the keys for a brief moment, letting the anticipation build naturally inside her. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, settling into a calm and steady rhythm. That rhythm matched the feeling in her hands, guiding her like an invisible path she knew by heart. Then she pressed the next note. It wasn't loud. It didn't explode with force, but it came out with a depth and clarity that didn't just fill the room, it shaped it. The sound carried something raw, something real, something that made people sit up straighter without even thinking about it. She kept playing, letting the melody rise gently before leaning into a stronger, fuller sound. Her fingers moved smoothly, almost like they were gliding across water. Each note seemed to breathe on its own, carrying emotion in a way that felt natural and effortless. The music was no longer just something she was playing, it was something she was sharing, something she was letting out of her heart and into the world. One of the judges leaned, so far forward that their elbows were nearly off the table. Another judge looked surprised, blinking as if trying to figure out whether they had misjudged her earlier. The tired expression they wore earlier was long gone. In the back row, someone shifted in their seat, not out of boredom but because the music pulled them in so deeply that they forgot to stay still. The boy who had been scrolling on his phone earlier now had his eyes glued to her hands. He didn't even blink as he watched the movement of her fingers. She didn't have to look at anyone to know the room had completely changed. She could feel it. There was a certain kind of electricity in the air that only appeared when music touched people in a way they didn't expect. She kept going, letting each note fall with intention. Even the softest ones felt meaningful, like tiny pieces of a story only she knew how to tell. She remembered every moment that led her here. The long hours practicing on the same old keyboard she was using now. The days she felt invisible. The times when people looked at her instrument and judged her before she played a single sound. She carried all of those moments inside her. But today, they didn't feel like weights. They felt like fuel. Her hands moved to the stronger section of the piece. The melody swelled, growing richer and more confident. The sound rolled through the hall like a wave, not overwhelming but powerful enough to make everyone feel something deep inside. Even the air felt different, as if the room itself was listening. The door at the back opened again. and two more people stepped inside, probably curious about why the hall had gone silent. One of them paused mid-step. The other turned to whisper something, but the first person held up a hand, signaling them to be quiet. They listened, eyes slowly widening as the music continued. On stage, she felt none of the eyes watching her. She didn't think about the judges or the people in the audience. She didn't think about the smirks she had seen earlier or the doubtful glances thrown her way. She was lost in the music now, lost in a world that only she knew how to enter. Her hands moved instinctively, as if the melody already lived inside them. When she reached a high passage, her touch grew lighter, like she was painting the notes with air. The sound floated gently, almost fragile, yet strong enough to hold everyone's attention. No one dared make a sound. Even the smallest movement in the audience felt like it would interrupt something sacred. She shifted into a part of the piece that carried more emotion than the rest. It was a section she had always connected with, even during practice. A section that made her remember all the times she felt uncertain, all the times she doubted herself, all the times she wondered if anyone would ever really hear her. As she played it now, the emotions came back. But they felt different, softer, warmer, almost like the music was healing those old feelings as it flowed out of her. Her voice wasn't speaking, but her music was. And the room was listening. The judge in the middle closed their eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over them. A staff member standing by the side of the hall slowly crossed their arms, not out of boredom, but because the music hit something inside them. Even the people who had come in late stood in the doorway, caught between stepping forward and staying frozen where they were. She continued to play, letting her fingers pour everything she felt into the keys. Her shoulders relaxed naturally, her breathing stayed steady, and the room stayed completely still. When she reached the peak of the emotional section, her fingers pressed deeper, bringing out a strong, full sound that spread across the hall like a warm blanket. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud just for the sake of being loud. It was powerful because it carried every part of her hope, her pain, her strength, her years of practice, her quiet determination. The music rose and rose, and for a moment it felt like time itself slowed. There was no whisper, no shifting chair, no cough. Not a single sound except her playing. In the back row, someone unconsciously placed their hand over their heart. The person beside them noticed and smiled softly without looking away from the stage. People weren't just watching her, they were feeling her music inside their own bodies. Then she eased out of the intense passage, letting the melody fall gently like raindrops after a storm. Her fingers softened again, moving lightly, delicately. The sudden change in emotion made the room lean in even more. It felt like the hall itself was listening, like the walls were absorbing every sound. She glanced down at her keyboard briefly, noticing again the scratch on the side and the tiny crack near the corner. For a second, she remembered all the times people told her she needed a better instrument if she wanted to be taken seriously. But right now, none of that mattered. Her old keyboard didn't hold her back. It carried her voice better than anything else ever had. As she played the quieter notes, she felt something shift inside her, something she hadn't expected. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't relief. It felt like acceptance. Acceptance of her own talent. Acceptance of her journey. Acceptance of the fact that she belonged on this stage. More than she realized. The music flowed gently as the emotions softened again. The hall was filled with a kind of peaceful silence that only comes when people are deeply moved. She let the melody rise just a little, letting a small hint of hope shine through the notes. It was subtle but powerful. The judge on the right smiled without thinking. The judge in the middle nodded softly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Her fingers slowed as she approached the final part of the piece. The air felt warmer, the lights felt softer, and the room felt completely connected to her. She played the last few notes with so much care that it felt like they floated in the air rather than struck the keys. Each note lingered just long enough to make every listener feel it. When she finally reached the last note, she let it ring out gently. Not one person moved, not one person breathed too loudly. Not one person looked away. The note hung in the air like a final whisper, like a secret being released into the room, and in that silent, breathless moment everyone finally understood why her very first note had stopped them cold. The real magic wasn't in her instrument. It wasn't in the fancy equipment others brought. It wasn't in confidence or appearance. It was in her heart, and the entire room felt it. The final note floated gently in the air, and for a moment it felt like the entire hall forgot how to breathe. The sound lingered, soft and calm, slowly fading into the silence. She kept her hands on the keys even after the note ended, letting the moment settle naturally. She didn't rush. She didn't lift her head in triumph. She simply stayed still, allowing the quiet to wrap around her like a warm blanket. When she finally removed her fingers from the keyboard, the silence continued. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that appears when people are so moved they don't know what to do next. She looked up slowly, her chest rising and falling gently as she took a deep breath. Her eyes scanned the room. Not knowing what to expect, that was when she saw the judges' faces. The judge in the middle had their mouth slightly open, almost like they were caught off guard. The judge on the left blinked several times, as if trying to clear away disbelief. The judge on the right looked like they had forgotten the pen in their hand, still holding it mid-air without moving. None of them looked bored anymore. None of them looked tired. They looked awake, alive with something she had not seen when she walked in. She didn't know what to make of those expressions. Were they impressed? Shocked? Unsure? She had no idea. All she knew was that she had played the best she could, and that was enough for her. From the back of the hall came a soft gasp. Someone whispered, "Wow," under their breath. Another person let out a slow exhale. A staff member who had been leaning against the wall wiped the corner of their eye with their sleeve, without drawing attention to themselves. Even the boy who had been glued to his phone earlier now sat with both hands resting on his knees, staring at her in awe. Then the silence broke. A single clap, light, almost hesitant, then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the casual kind people give out of habit. It was loud, full, and genuine, like the sound of people who finally realized they had witnessed something rare. The applause grew stronger and stronger, echoing off the walls. Some people even stood up from their seats, clapping with both hands as if they wanted the sound to reach her heart. She sat there, frozen, stunned. She wasn't used to this kind of reaction. In her life, applause was usually small, maybe from a music teacher or a family friend. But this was different. This was applause from people who didn't know her, people who had expected nothing from her, people who were now looking at her like she had just shifted something inside them. She felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her expression calm. She didn't want to break down in front of everyone. She simply bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the applause with quiet gratitude. When the clapping finally began to fade, the judge in the middle leaned closer to the microphone and said softly, "Thank you. Please wait outside for a moment." She nodded and carefully unplugged her keyboard. Her hands were steady, but her legs felt strangely light as she stood up. As she walked off the stage, she noticed people watching her differently now. Not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with respect, real respect. The kind she had never received from strangers before. When she passed by the doorway, she caught sight of a woman standing near the wall with her hand over her heart. Their eyes met for just a second, and the woman gave her a small smile. A warm, proud kind of smile. She didn't know the woman, but seeing that smile made something inside her feel full. She stepped out into the waiting area, where everything was still noisy and chaotic. People were talking, practicing, scrolling on their phones, and complaining about how long the wait was. The moment she entered, some of them turned to look at her. Their expressions changed. Some seemed surprised, others seemed curious, and a few looked like they wished they had gone inside earlier to hear her play. The loud young man with the fancy keyboard was sitting in a chair closest to the door. He had been joking with a group of friends before she walked in, but when he saw her, his laughter stopped in an instant. His friends turned their heads too, Curious about what had silenced him, his smirk was gone, completely gone. Instead, his eyes looked confused, almost shaken. He sat up straighter, his eyebrows drawn together, as if he couldn't understand what had just happened. He had expected her to fail, he had been sure of it. But clearly something else had happened. Something he didn't predict. She walked past him without saying a word. Not out of pride. Not out of revenge. She simply didn't need his approval anymore. The music had spoken for her in ways words never could. He swallowed and stood up slowly. "Hey," he said softly, but she didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She kept walking until she found an empty seat in the corner, the same way she had earlier, except now she didn't feel small or overlooked. She felt grounded, aware of herself, aware of her worth. A few minutes later, the hall door opened again. The judge in the middle called her inside. Her heart raced a little, but she stood up with calm steps and followed them back. This time, when she entered the room, the atmosphere felt completely different. It wasn't cold and formal. It felt warm, welcoming, almost like the judges wanted to stand up and greet her, but were trying to stay professional. "Please sit," the judge said, gesturing to a chair. She sat down softly, her hands resting in her lap. The judge on the right leaned forward first. "We didn't expect that," they said with a gentle smile. "Your playing was, moving. Truly moving." The middle judge nodded. "You have something rare. Not just skill, but heart. You play with emotion, not just technique. And that is not something we hear often." She felt her face warm up slightly. She wasn't used to praise like this. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply bowed her head a little. The judge on the left added, "We would like to move you to the next round. And beyond that, we'd like to discuss something else with you after the competition." She blinked. "Something else?" "We see potential," the judge continued. "And we think you deserve opportunities, real ones." For a moment she couldn't speak. The world around her felt soft, like she was surrounded by sunshine she never expected. Her voice came out quietly. "Thank you." When she walked out of the room again, she wasn't the same girl who had walked in earlier. She wasn't the quiet girl with the old keyboard whom people ignored. She wasn't the girl who carried doubts like heavy stones. She felt lighter now, stronger, and when she stepped back into the waiting area, people seemed to sense that change. Some moved aside to give her space. Others watched her with admiration. The young man approached her again, but this time he wasn't smirking. He wasn't joking. He wasn't showing off. He looked uncertain, even embarrassed. "Hey," he said quietly. I didn't expect that. You were really good?" His voice cracked slightly, like he wasn't used to admitting things like this. She looked at him, not with anger, not with revenge, but with calmness. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded and stepped back, unsure what else to say. She didn't need more than that. Her music had already done the talking. As she held her keyboard. Case again, this time with pride instead of self-consciousness, she realized something important. It didn't matter how old her instrument was. It didn't matter who doubted her. It didn't matter who smirked or whispered when she played. The world listened. And sometimes that was all it took to change everything.